Yes, I know, it's been a while since I've done a video. There is a reason for that. I actually got a chance to do to go to San Antonio to see the Final Four, or at least one of the games of the Final Four. The KU North Carolina game. I'm a huge KU fan, so that was a big thing. And honestly, I was like, you know what? If they don't win the championship, I'll be okay, because they beat Williams, and that's all that matters. That's all that mattered, because he still doesn't have a title with his own players. That title he won wasn't his players. I'm sorry, it wasn't. Okay, so next, let's get started with this. As the title says, Joe's champ. Do you care? And I think it's a fair question, because I don't think people care, and that's sad, because 2 years ago, I think people cared. I think a year ago, I think people cared. I think I think a little bit over a year ago, I think people really cared. The fact of the matter is, and this is my thing, this is why I'm so angry with TNA over how they use Joe. There is an old adage that unless you have a guy who doesn't need the title, i.e. Undertaker, back in the day, Undertaker had a gimmick that he didn't need the title. That his gimmick was so that he didn't have to have the title to be considered the man. Just kind of the way it was. Same thing, Andre the Giant was kind of the same way. And you've had guys periodically that have that's just kind of the way it was. I would argue that, you know, Goldberg didn't necessarily need the title, though storyline wise he had to have the title. And if TNA had built Joe up like that, to where, you know, he didn't want the title, he just wanted to take on the best, and i.e. while, you know, Angle and Cage and Sting were all fighting for the title, you know, they were bringing in New Japan guys for him just to destroy and him to take on, because he wanted to take on the best, because he saw himself that much better than everybody else in TNA. And then eventually he would go after the title. And that's not how they did it. So by the time, of course, they brought in Kurt Angle, and I would argue that even before that, if you go back and you look at the Bound for Glory, Kurt Angle reffed, and look what happened. Joe was basically in a who cares match because they didn't know how to do with him. How do you not know how to do with your number one guy? Like it or not, TNA fans, Joe has been pretty much the number one guy since, I would say, 3 months after he got in the company. He has been their number one draw. You go around, you look at when they were farming guys out to independents. Look at what the numbers he brought in. Look how many people will go and see a Joe match. Go ask ROH fans. You know, as soon as Joe left, the numbers of the ROH crowds started going down. They eventually started going back up, but that was a huge deficit to fill. You know, you go back and you look at last year's the actual pay-per-view buy rates, and you look at the pay-per-view buy rates, and guess what? The ones that Joe main evented were usually the ones that got the highest buy rates. This has been a long time coming, and I think it's gotten to the point where fans don't care, because they're like, why should I care? The build-up for this has been horrible. You know, they've done their job, but really, Joe Angle has taken a back seat to Joe versus Styles. You know, Joe versus Styles is the main storyline, which is complete and utter garbage. If they wanted to do that storyline, or even if they were just hinting and they saw it could go somewhere, they should have prolonged the storyline and waited and not advanced it until after Angle lost the title. Then you could do AJ and Angle, and it wouldn't make Joe's title run look like, you know, oh, well, it's just Joe getting the title. Because that's what it looks like. It looks like just Joe getting the title. It doesn't look like he's being coordinated as the guy, as he's going to be the guy to carry the company. And that is what TNA needs. Because, like it or not, you have to have a guy which the casual fans, and even us smart fans, somewhere subconsciously will look and go, WWE missed out on that guy. That guy could be in the WWE. That guy could be a main eventer in the WWE. You know, and it can't be a former WWE guy. It has to be one of your own guys. For whatever reason, it's always been that way. You go back and look at ECW. When ECW really got big was when they brought in their own guys, and you had guys where people felt could be in WCW and could be in WWF and could hold their own with the main eventers, could be main eventers in both companies. You had guys like that, and ECW people's minds, in Taz, in Sabu, and in Rob Van Dam later on. So that's important. And the fact that TNA has totally just forgotten that when it comes to Joe, and this is one thing, you see, I'm such a big Joe fan. I wouldn't even, honestly, I wouldn't do TNA reviews, I wouldn't talk about TNA, I wouldn't even care about TNA, except that Joe's there. It's the only reason why I care. I think there's a lot of people like that, that if Joe left the company, who cares about TNA anymore? Honestly, I think that's the way a lot of people feel, because that's why they watch. You know, Joe, on a very small scale, carried Ring of Honor. Carried it. Most of you probably don't know this. Ring of Honor was on its deathbed. Deathbed. I'm talking, people thought it was going to go out of business. And Joe and Punk came along and carried that company. And then Joe continually carried it. To the point when he left, I got news for you. There were a lot of Ring of Honor fans that thought it was going to be it. That there was no way they were going to be able to fill that void. They eventually ended up filling it. I don't think to the extent that Joe was. I don't think you can ever, you know, replace him. But I think they did end up filling it up. But you know what? TNA basically took a guy who was considered one of the best in-ring talents in the world and basically made him look like anybody else on the TNA roster. And that's the problem. You know, I mean, him winning the title should be a coronation. It should be a moment, a momentous moment, a huge moment, a shift, if you will, in direction and in everything within TNA. And that's not what this is going to be. I have a firm belief that's not what this is going to be, and so I don't think anyone's going to care. I think a year and a half ago, I think people would have cared. I think people would have cared. I think people would have gotten excited. I think TNA would have been able to build on it, and I think TNA would be in a much, I think, even though I think they're in a good place right now, because they're doing house shows, which I've been talking about since I got on here, and since Jared or Virus was talking about even before I got on here, that's what they need to do, la la la. That, if you would have just built the company around Joe, pay-per-view numbers might be better. I believe they would be better, to be completely honest. Go back and look. I think that the ratings would be far better than they are now. I think you would have seen a huge improvement. I think they would have passed ECW. The fact that they are still behind ECW, in my opinion, has to be seen as a failure because ECW has such a weak roster. I like the show for the most part, but it's a weak roster when it comes to, you know, a wrestling show on television. That's a weak roster. Those types of things. And I think it's time for people, I would love to read the comments and see, do people care about Joe winning? Because I don't. And that's sad because I'm such a huge Joe fan. I'm such a huge Joe mark. And I've always told myself when Joe won the title, if I felt like he was going to win the title, I would order the pay-per-view. And I have. Every time that I thought, well, maybe they would give it to him. Even when he took on Christian Cage, and I thought maybe they'd give it to him. I ordered that pay-per-view. But I haven't ordered one since. That was, you know, since last year's lockdown, which, let me tell you something. Yes, let's look forward to, well, I hope they better improve over last year's lockdown. But I think it's a good question, because I think it's a question I think TNA needs to be asking themselves. Does anybody care? Because they've done such an absolutely horrible job of building this up as, you know, Joe's shot. That's all. I'm out.